Okay, so I'm going to show you here something really interesting. The 13 tribes of Israel and how they moved to America. Now, this was the original 13 colonies. We see them here. And they basically will line up exactly the way they did in the Middle East and how they did in Europe with the same groups of people. Now, please remember that the borders that you see on these states were not exactly like this. These borders were well defined later, but not at the time that the tribes were moving to America, which is the 13 tribes of Israel coming out of Europe. Now, these are the 12, 13 tribes. Actually, it's 13 because they took Joseph out. He didn't get a land portion, but the land portion went to his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And so this is how we have determined that these nations that are the 12 tribes are now the modern nations today. These are the modern nations today, okay? And each one of them represented one European nation. Okay, so you notice that Simeon and Levi do not have any because they were told that they would not inherit. They would live among their brothers. So that really makes 10 actual nations or nationalities of people. Okay, so these tribes that we have, we've identified them with different nations and nationalities. And we're going to talk about at the end of this program how we chose the ones that we did. I have many programs and teachings out there where I cover this, either on my webpage or on YouTube. So you can go out and listen to the explanation for each one of those, but I'm going to give a small explanation at the end. Now let's look at this. This is Canaan. This is the old land of Israel. And this is how they lined up. You can see this. And when they moved into Europe, they lined up identically the same way. Now, if you take and move England over a little closer to Europe, you see that it's the same alignment as they did in the old land of Israel. They lined up identically the same. Now, here we go. Genesis 48 explains identifying the nations of Israel today. And this is so that you can see how these tribes lined up. So you had up here at the top, you had Dan, you had Asher, Naphtali, Manasseh. We're going to go through each one of these, and you're going to see how they came in as nationalities and groups. And we're going to cover the history. All right, the first one is Maine. That was the Massachusetts Maine colony, and they were Manasseh. So you would see here that if you're looking right here, you can see that this is Manasseh, and this is where they came in and they settled in this area of Maine and Massachusetts. There was two colonies for Manasseh. You can see that one, and Manasseh is also here. Do y'all see that? So you get one coming from Massachusetts and one coming from Maine. Now, here's the history on the colony of Maine. It was an English settlement. It settled in southern Maine. It eventually became absorbed into the Manassas Bay Colony in 1658. They both became the same colony. Now it says in 1669, the territory between Quebec and St. Croix rivers were granted by Charles II to his brother James, the Duke of York. And the man who settled this, his name was Thomas George. Okay, he was the original settler, and I think that was in 1639. Now, again, Massachusetts, okay, this was the Massachusetts Bay Colony, one of the original English settlements, settled in 1630 by a group of 1,000 Puritans. The charter was 1691. From the Plymouth colony, and Maine and Massachusetts were in the same colony. Now, the next one we're going to talk about is this one right here, which is Maryland. And Maryland would also have become part of this Massachusetts colony, they would become part of that Massachusetts colony. They would be an English colony. Do y'all see that? Now, Maryland was granted a royal charter. This was given to Cecil Calvin, the Lord of Baltimore, in 1632. Many of the settlers were actually Roman Catholic. Maryland would be an English colony. It would be also the tribe of Manasseh. Now, Dan, how interesting Dan is, it's right up here at the top. It's in the top part of the all of these colonies. And it would actually be the Irish people. They would come from Ireland, and they would settle in that area that we call Massachusetts. This is where the tribe, the Irish people came in. They came in and settled in the area around Boston, if you'll remember the history. All right, and so they also had another little settlement, and that was in Maryland also. So they had two little settlements, one in Massachusetts, one in Maryland. All right, the Irish settled Maryland. They were a Catholic settlement. Massachusetts in 1633, the first group of settlers sailed for the colony led by Calvet. In 1633, approximately 140 settlers left England. 17 colonists were Roman Catholic gentlemen. The rest of them were Protestant indentured servants. So this was a Catholic settlement, and Dan was a Catholic state. All right, so now we get to the next one. These are the Norwegians. They came in to New York, the upper part of New York. You can see New York here, and this would be the area that for Asher and Naphtali in that area. Now let's go through this. The upper part of New York, Asher, Naphtali, in 1664, 60 Norwegians settled first in Manhattan and soon moved to the area around the Hudson River, now Albany. The second group of Norwegian immigrants came to America on July 1825. There was 52 of them. They came to the harbor in October 9th. There was for 93 days. They stayed there, and then they moved themselves up to the upper part of New York. How interesting. Now we come to Zebulon. Zebulon was the Dutch. We know that the settlement of New York, especially New York City, was done by the Dutch. Long Island, New York City, all in that area was settled by the Dutch. It was called New Amsterdam, if you remember, for the longest time. So here we go. Here's another settlement. Came right down underneath these two right here, which is Asher and Naphtali. It comes right down underneath it. Do y'all see that? Which is lining up exactly the way they did in the old land of Israel. All right, the Dutch settlement into New York and Manhattan, the colony was called New Netherlands or the New Amsterdam. It later became New York City. The settlement outside of Fort Amsterdam on Manhattan Island in the New Netherlands in 1614 to 1664 was a extension of the Dutch Republic as of 1624. Okay, so the Swedes and the Finns, they would have been the tribe of Issachar. Do y'all see that? They would have been in this Delaware, New Jersey area. Now, Swedes. The Swedes came in from and settled in the area of Delaware and New Jersey area. And the Swedes would have been the tribe of, and it's also the Finns too. The Swedes and the Finns would have came in, and they would have settled in this area that is New Jersey and Delaware. And you can see them here. They're underneath Zebulon, just like they're underneath New York here. Same thing. Okay, so at that point in history, Sweden was much larger and Finland was much larger area than it is today. It had actually extended into the top part of that area in Europe. And so you can see here Sweden here And this was the Swedish Empire, and these people came from that point into and lined themselves up exactly like they did in the old land of Israel. Now, I'm going to give you the history here. New Sweden is what they called it. It was and it was in the Delaware River. This was settled between 638 and 655. They settled into that area around New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. The fort was called Fort Christina. It was in Wellington, Delaware. It was the first settlement of Swedes to claim land on the west side of the South River. That is Philadelphia today. All right, so settlement was incorporated into the Dutch New Netherlands in September 15, 1655. The percentage of Swedes in New Sweden rose 50% when the colony came under Dutch rule. All right, so you can actually see this here on the map. You can see New Netherlands. This is what it basically, you see how it looked different. The maps looked different back then. I would like to get a real good map of what the territories looked like back then, but I haven't been able to find one. All right, the first known settlement was in New Jersey. It was in Fort Elfsborg and said to have been established along the Salem River by the governor of New Sweden in 1648. Now, here's Pennsylvania. You always hear about the Pennsylvania Germans. The Germans came into the area of Pennsylvania. Those would have been the tribe of Gad. Gad, you see, is lining itself up down here. So you have this whole area, which is representing Gad. All right, and that would be Pennsylvania Dutch. Now, that would be the tribe of Gad. The Germans settled mainly in Pennsylvania in 1790. The Pennsylvania Dutch are the German of German descent. In 1600s, they represented 99% of the population. Today, it represents 1/4, because Gad was to be, in Deuteronomy 33, verse 20, that Gad would be blessed and would be enlarged, which meaning it would be a large nationality. Now, the Quakers also came into Pennsylvania, and that was a Welsh settlement, and this would be some of the people from Levi and Simeon. They stayed, they actually migrated into Wales. All indentured servants came through Pennsylvania, and the Quakers helped them get their jobs and helped them get a job as an indentured servant so that they can pay off their debt accrued when they came over to this country, because many of them signed themselves up to be indentured servants so that they can have their own land. And Philadelphia actually means the city of brotherly love. Now, here we come with Virginia. You see Virginia here. That would represent Ephraim. That would represent the tribe of Ephraim. Do y'all see that? It is an English colony, permanent English colony, settled in Virginia in Jamestown in 1607 by John Smith. We know this history. 1606, the group of wealthy London businessmen petitioned King James I to establish a colony in the New World. Okay, and they had an Anglican religion because they were English. All right, now, the Huguenots came into North Carolina. This is North Carolina. The Huguenots would have been from France. Those would be the tribe of Ruben. Do you see how it's pushing itself down underneath Ephraim and Gad? You can see it. You can see where it's situated here. They're all lining themselves up just like they did in the land of Israel. Now, North Carolina, this is where the French Huguenots would come in, like we mentioned, okay? And now here's their history. It wasn't until 1690s, the early 1700s, that the French Huguenots, a religious group, migrated to North Carolina because they lost their religious freedom through Louis XIV in an edict of Fontainebleau, with a large population of ministers, merchants, craftsmen, physicians leaving France, and the country itself suffered a huge loss. Now, that wasn't the only settlement. There was an early settlement, and that one was in 1562. This settlement was in 1562 by Captain Jean Ribaut, led by 150 Huguenots that were simply trying to practice their faith, landed in modern-day Jacksonville. The Spanish king was accused of wiping them out. It really was mercenaries to wipe some of these people out. So this was a settlement, like we said, it was a settlement into Carolina area. Now, South Carolina, North Carolina, in that area. Now, North Carolina, South Carolina, this is where the Scottish people settled, many of the Scottish people, and even today, there's more Scottish people in North Carolina than there is in all of Scotland. So that would have been the tribe of Benjamin. You see him right here, Benjamin. He would have been that tribe. Notice how he's lining up underneath Ephraim, underneath Gad, you know, right just in that same area of Ruben. All of it's lining up very much the same. The history on these people, this was Sir Walter Raleigh that tried to establish an English colony there, but he died. So it was left in 1665 to John Yearsman to establish the second colony around Cape Fear River in Wilmington. They were from Scotland, Ireland, and the West Indies. Approximately 1.5 million Scots have migrated to America. Today, the state of North Carolina, as we mentioned, has more citizens of Scot ancestry than any other state, and including Scotland. How interesting is that? And these would be called, many of these people would be called the Highlanders. You can see this river right in here. This is where they settled. Now, Georgia would have been settled also by the Highlanders. You see this whole area here. They actually brought in and hired mercenaries out of Scotland to live along the edge of Georgia to keep the Spanish out of the area of the 13 colonies. Oglethorpe was chosen to be the governor of Georgia. He traveled to America with 35 families in 1733. The colonists included many Scots whose pioneer skill was greatly assisting the colony, and many other settlers contained poor English tradesmen and religious refugees from Switzerland, France, Germany, as well as the German refugees. How interesting. All right, so interesting history. Now, in October 1735, this is when John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church, became a missionary, and a large group of Scotch Highlanders. The Scots were among the finest soldiers in the world and were recruited by General James Oglethorpe. And they used them, like I said, as a buffer between the Florida, where the Spanish had come in and settled. Now, I do want to talk about the Highlanders, because the Highlanders were the Scottish people that settled in the very top of the mountain area in Scotland. And they came out in around the 4th century. They moved themselves out of Ireland, out of the top of Ireland into Scotland. And that's why they called them the Scotch-Irish people. But they were different than the Irish people in the southern part of Ireland. They were a different nationality. And I believe those are the people that are the descendants from the Milesians. And we know the history of the Milesians, that they came out of Egypt. I believe that those people were one of the tribes of Judah. And they came into the United States as indentured servants, came in, as we've talked before about these people. It's very interesting. There's a lot of history around this. Now, we can go in and look at some of this explanation around each one of these tribes. Reuben was the firstborn. He was to have strength and dignity. He would be France and power. He has been the powerhouse in Europe for its entire history. And you can go back and look at their history and see that. Simeon and Levi were considered cruel, and they would not inherit. They would be divided into Jacob, scattered among the other tribes. Judah would be his father's children will bow down before him. He would have the scepter of Judah. The law would be between his feet. He would be more religious. He's talking about spiritual law. He would be the more conservative one of the tribes. The Judah is very interesting because that is the tribe that we call the Highlanders. They basically, their history was that they lived in Northern Ireland. They moved into Scotland at the very top of Scotland, and their ancestry goes back to the Milesians, which are the Jewish tribe that came out of Egypt. And that history is recorded in the Irish history by Geoffrey Keating. Now, Zebulon, he said he would dwell by the sea and have ships. That would be the Dutch. They were merchants in Europe. Issachar, strong ass couched down between two burdens. That would be Finland was located between Russia and Europe. Okay. Now, the children of Issachar, which were men that had understanding of their times, that was Swiss. That would be the Swiss people. Those people have made watches and clocks their entire history. And so they are considered, it talks about them in scripture as the people that actually understand the times. Do y'all see that? Understand the times. Now, Dan was to judge his people. What they would be judges and policemen. If you look in New York City, you saw that there was a lot of policemen that were Irish. That's easy to see. They talk about the Irish policemen in New York, and remember that New York was one of the places that Dan settled. The Irish people settled there, but they first settled in Boston. All right, so he said tribe of Dan would have to wait for their salvation. They never went through the Protestant Reformation like the other tribes. Gad would be like a troop, a warlike troop. They would be a large group, like a lion, very powerful. Germans are the largest population of people in America. And, Asher would be one that would create royal delicacies. The royal delicacies is foods and pastries, and the people of Belgium, and in that area, that's where you get the Belgian waffles. Some of the candies come out of that area and around the Netherlands and in Belgium. So Asher would mainly be the people in the area of Denmark. They would have been up there near their brothers in the Scandinavian countries. They would have been in Denmark. They would have also extend themselves down into the area of Belgium. Both of them are famous for foods. The Belgians make chocolates and Belgian waffles, and we also know about the Danish pastries. And this is what these people have been identified as and with. And remember, at that time, they would have been under Swedish control when they came in. So this is definitely the tribe of Asher that came in around the area of New Jersey and Delaware. All right, Naphtali was supposed to be like a deer that was let loose, giving it goodly words. Naphtali was located in both the area of Sweden and Norway, and so was Issachar. Issachar was in the area of Sweden also. So you had these two tribes, both of these two tribes up there, but the area of Sweden extended at the time of the colonization. It extended down. Why they were called the Swedes when they came in, but the people that are truly in Sweden right now mainly are the tribe of Naphtali. And you had some other tribes up there also. The Swedes, on their coat of arms, they have a deer, and I think that's really interesting. Now, Joseph was to be a fruitful bough that was very fruitful. Its branches would go over the walls. It would be the most blessed and wealthy of the tribes. And our nation represents Ephraim today. 27, Benjamin would be like a wolf in the morning, and he should devour his prey. He would have been the people, the 8th century, they pushed their way into Europe, and they would be the people that spoiled Europe. This was the Viking raids that you hear about in history. And they would eventually go in and settle in the lower part of Scotland. Many of them settled in that area. And that's really all of them. That is an explanation of how the 13 colonies came into this country, and they lined themselves up just like they did in the Middle East.
For more information about this broadcast, please visit our website at www.12tribehistory.com. That is the number 12, tribehistory.com, or email us at lwatson44@cox.net with any questions or comments.